received that confirmation. So with your permission, Chair, I'll take this as adherent for the meeting of the Executive Committee of the 23rd of June 2021.
Thanks, Pauline.
I see that Councillor Allison is here, also Councillor Anderson, Councillor Bradley is here, as is Councillor Brown. I have apologies on behalf of Councillor Callaghan. Councillor Horsham, I understand that you are substituting for Councillor Callaghan. Can you confirm your attendance, please?
I'm here, Pauline.
Thank you. Councillor Chalmers, I see that you're here, as is Councillor Convery. Councillor Cooper.
Present.
Thank you. I see that Councillor Corbett is here, also Councillor Craig. I see that Councillor Devlin is here, as is Councillor Dorman. Councillor Fagan is here. Councillor Faulkner is here, as is Councillor Hamilton, Councillor Logan and Councillor Loudon. Councillor Lowe. Nothing from Councillor Lowe. Councillor McAdams.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor McCreary.
Councillor Lowe's there. I can see his picture. He's on screen.
Oh. Councillor Lowe, can you unmute yourself and just confirm your presence, please? I'll come back and I can check that on the attendance at the end of the meeting, so that's not a problem. Councillor McAdams is here. Councillor McCreary?
Yes, I'm here, Pauline.
Thank you. Councillor McGuigan?
Here.
Councillor Miller, I see that you're here. Councillor Nealon is here. Councillor Nelson?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Councillor Ross is here. Councillor Shearer is here. Councillor Wardhaw is here. Councillor Wilson?
I'm here, Pauline.
Thank you. And there are a number of officers present at the meeting also. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Welcome everyone to this Executive Committee. We have a fairly large agenda, as I said earlier. Would colleagues please feel free to ask as many questions of the officers as you need to, but could we keep our comments to a minimum so that we can get through this business and also the business of the full council today. I'll start with item 1, which is a declaration of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? None that I see of. Fine, we'll move on to item 2, which is the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 26th of May. These are in pages 5 to 12. Does any colleague have any questions on the previous minutes? I'm seeing no hands raised. I'll move the minutes of the previous meeting.
A second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. We'll move on to the monitoring items, starting with item 3, which is revenue budget outturn 2020 to 21 on pages 13 to 30. And I would ask Paul to give us a report on this, please.
Thanks, Chair. As you say, this is the outturned position for year 2021. So this is effectively the year-end position, and these are the figures that are incorporated into the Council's annual accounts. So I'd probably start off by going to the second page of the paper, right? And I'll take you to section 4, and that gives a summary of what we had reported previously. So the last time we came to the Executive Committee with a position, it was to the April Committee. And what we've shown there in the table is the position that we reported at that point. So that was an underspend of £2.163 million. Now, section 5 gives an executive summary of the contents. It's an extensive paper. There's a number of appendices. So I'll go through the executive summary. The first thing it tells you is that year-end position has moved from £2.163 million of an underspend to £2.595 million. So that's an improvement in the position. And at 5.2, it takes you through the reasons for that. So it directs you to increased income from council tax and the fact that we've spent less across a couple of areas within the council's budget. So that's what's improved that position. And getting to that position for the year end and incorporated in the accounts, there are 3 sets of transfers to reserves happening. And that's what the rest of that executive summary goes through. So the first of those sets of transfers to reserves are the amounts that we identified when we reported the probable outturn. Right, so that's back in February. And that, when we reported the probable outturn, we'd said £10.574 million would go into reserves in relation to those items. They're covered in the appendices. That's moved slightly, right? It's become 10.337, and that's because of an increase in spend against those items that's happened during year 2021. So there's a second set of transfers to reserves, and this is covered at 5.4. They total £12.942 million, and what that reflects is the impact of COVID on resources' ability to spend on commitments against specific streams of money of funding that the councils received in large part during the final part of the year. The carry forward of that money allows those committed areas of spend to be incurred in 21-22. So because of COVID, not being able to spend, but if we transfer to reserves, we can achieve that in 21-22. Now, the paper goes through what each of those are in detail in sections 6.4 to 6.11. And again, there's an appendix 4, which summarises that and gives you even more detail in relation to those things. The third set of transfers to reserves is about COVID funding. And you can see this summarised in section 5.6 of the paper. And what that reflects is that the fact that we had a position which we reported to the last executive committee that we brought figures to back in April. And what we said was that we thought we would carry forward COVID funding of £18 million. We're actually going to carry forward COVID funding of £31 million. So that's an increase of nearly 13.5. And at 5.7, you can see the reasons, or the main reasons laid out in terms of where that increase in money being carried forward is coming from. Now, for example, since then, as it says, we've had £4.6 million in terms of money which is given to us for these discretionary fund payments. So the unspent money gets carried forward. So that accounts for part of that increase. So as I say, there are 3 sets of contributions to reserves that get us to that year-end position, right, of an underspend of £2.595 million. Now, the last part of the executive summary at section 5.9 covers what we would propose is done with that. So you can see 3 bullet points under 5.9, which put forward proposals for the use of that money. One of them is the replacement of what we would call our main enterprise systems. So our financial management system, our HR, payroll, purchasing and procurement systems. These are coming to end of life. And what I would suggest is we put £1 million of that money to the side to help facilitate replacement of these in the coming years. The second proposed use of the money is to help pay for audio-visual equipment upgrades for the council chamber and committee room 1 to help facilitate blended meetings, right, post-recess. So this would improve the equipment and it would make that a possibility. And the third thing is to create a fund of money which we can use moving forward beyond even year 2021-22 to try and address potential COVID costs. So that's a summary of how we get to that year-end position and what we propose is done with the remaining underspend, which is there at the end of that process. These are the figures that are going to be included in the council's accounts. So they were actually taken to the Risk and Audit Committee yesterday, and they've been, or they will be submitted to Audit Scotland at the end of the month. So in terms of recommendations, what the paper looks for is noting of that underspend position. It looks for approval of those transfers to reserves. It also looks for approval of the use of that remaining underspend. And it also asks for specific approvals in relation to balances held by the IJB. And as I say, just at the end of that, also notes for approval of the position or for noting of the position rather on the housing revenue account. So again, Chair, happy to take any questions on the paper. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul, for that comprehensive report. Does any colleague have any questions of Paul on this item? I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you much, colleagues. We'll move on to item 4, which is the Capital Budget Monitoring Final Outturn 2020-21. It's on pages 31 to 38. And again, I would ask Paul to give a report on this, please.
Thanks, Chair. So this paper's doing the same thing for the capital programme. It's bringing you the year-end position and it's showing you what's going to be included in those accounts. So in terms of how this compares, the same way that we did with the last report, how does this compare with the last set of figures that we showed you? So again, we came in April with a spend position that we thought we were going to be able to get to by the end of the year. We've actually spent £3.3 million less than that. And that is shown, it's summarised at section 4.1 in the paper. And you can see the specific projects there where the money hasn't been spent in year 2021, but it will be spent in year 2021-22. So again, part of what I'm going to ask for permission to do, and the recommendations at the end, is to carry forward an amount of money, right, to deal with that in the new year. The section 4.3 goes through year-end accounting adjustments, and there are two main things that are happening there. One of the things that we're doing is to say, okay, we had a spend that was actually penciled in the 2021-22 programme. We can bring that forward and make that spend in year 2020-21. What that relates to is one of the savings initiatives that we agreed to as we put together the 21-22 budget, and it was about effectively buying assets that we used to lease, right? So what we've got the opportunity to do is to do that in 21-22, and that makes sure that we get the full value of that. We get the full value of that saving in year 21-22. So we're making that transaction in year 2021. So that's appearing in those accounts. The other thing that's happening, and this is covered in sections 4.4 and 4.5, this happens every year. At the end of the year, our accountants sit the various items of expenditure and make sure that there's nothing sitting in the capital account that's effectively revenue or vice versa, and there have to be swaps of that spend and the funding at the end of the year so that it's in line for the accounts, and that's what's happening and was picked out in those sections. There's also a section at the foot of page 32 and the top of page 33, there's a summary of what was delivered through the housing account. Actually, more was delivered there than we had budgeted. There was more income taken in, which pays for about £800,000 of that. And to pay for the balance, what's happening is that enough money will be brought forward from next year's funding to pay for that. But that, in this case, is about things being delivered earlier and having to bring the money forward in order to do that. So in terms of recommendations, if I can go back to page 31, we're looking for noting of the outturn position, and that's against the general fund and against the housing programme. We're also looking for carry forward of an amount of money, which is £11.1 million that's accrued across the year, that we carry forward into the new year, and that in relation to these monies that didn't spend but will spend in the new year, and we need to take the money forward. And there's also the recommendations finish off just by noting the fact that we've got a paper later on in the agenda which launches our 2021-22 programme. So again, Chair, any questions, happy to take them.
Thanks very much, Paul. Does any colleague have any questions? Again, I'm seeing no hands raised, so I'll move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Move on to item 5, which is the revenue budget monitoring for period 2. That's on pages 39 to 48. And Paul, could you give this report again, please?
Right, thanks, Chair. This is about the new year, and this is end to the 21st of May. So this is the first report on the revenue budget for the new year. Usually pretty uncomplicated at this point, which in large part this is. The complicating factor that is in there is about COVID funding. Right? And this has been the pattern across the past year. So what the paper talked about, and this is at the foot of page 39, is just recognising the fact that in the budget is an amount of money in relation to COVID funding. The first amount that's referenced is that amount of £25.394 million. You'll remember we've reported that to committee. That's the council's share of a series of nationally allocated amounts which we've got to fund COVID activity during the year. One point I would make is in terms of a bit of a change in the 21-22 position in comparison to last year, the government are consciously saying we will give out a more significant amount of money headed up as COVID flexibility in answer to points councils raised about getting a whole series of smaller amounts of money coming through during the year. So the point I'm making is I don't expect to get the same level of additions to the budget through 21-22 as we had in 2021. This is a significant amount of money coming in. I wouldn't expect to see this repeated across the course of the year. Now, at the top of the second page, I'm acknowledging the fact that we've brought forward £31.5 million worth of COVID money. So this was picked up from the report about closing down last year's revenue budget. We've brought forward £31.5 million worth of COVID funding from 2020-21. So that joins that £25.5 million in the amount as the amount of COVID funding that we've got for year 21-22. So that's the complicating factor that's in there. 4.3 picks up just our analysis of COVID spend in those first sort of 6 weeks of the year. And what you can see there at table 1 is a breakdown of that, and there's an appendix at the rear that breaks that down over departments. So that's just under £1.3 million at that point at the 21st of May. What you need to remember, and this is picked up at 4.5, that doesn't include any additional costs in relation to social work of the pandemic. Those are being picked up through what's called the mobilisation plan. So that means they're being reimbursed via NHS. The paper also makes reference to the loans fund position. And what you'll remember from the budget strategy across the past couple of years, to this meeting, the June meeting last year, you approved what was called the loans fund review, and that was about how we write off debt against assets, and it freed up an amount of money. So part of that will appear through our monitoring position this year, and that's in line with what the committee agreed last year. So that's picked up at the foot of that page. There's also a section, page 41, just around at the start of the year, again, running an eye over the budget to make sure that things of a capital and revenue nature are being dealt with appropriately. And that means movement between those two accounts at this point of the year as well. So that's picked up on that third page of the papers. So just to go back to the recommendations, what this is looking for is noting of the position on the revenue budget and in relation to that COVID funding and on the housing revenue account budget as well. So again, Chair, happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Paul. I see Councillor Brown has his hand up.
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Paul, for those reports. Could I ask at 5.4, the reference to the roads carriageway revenue budget? Now, it's not so much about the movement of funding, which I follow, but we put some extra money into the roads and pavements budgets this year. We're now, of course, June, heading towards July. I know some of it is to be participatory budgeting. Can I ask really two things? Given the ongoing restrictions of COVID working, are we confident of spending the roads and pavements allocation for road repairs and so forth during the year effectively? And secondly, do we have yet a kind of programme of works, including the PB stuff? What's the timetable of all of that? Thanks very much.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, I'm sure that can be answered by Michael. I have some information. Michael.
Thanks, Chair. So to take the first point, I think our workforce has adapted well to the restrictions. We still have the restrictions of 2 operatives within vehicles. However, we have made very pragmatic arrangements to ensure that we are delivering on the programme. So I've got a fair degree of confidence at this point in time, Councillor Brown. In relation to the PB exercise, members may recall that was undertaken, I think, in April, May. The conclusions of the survey have now informed the thematic areas and now informed the actual projects which will be taken forward in terms of footways, carriageways, but also interestingly there was quite a lot of support for improvements to the footways and pathways within our parks and country parks also. So that exercise has concluded, and will now be in a position, as agreed, to report these matters to the Area Committee for information and awareness, Councillor Brown. So that additional £2 million money is now being programmed to be spent within 21-22. So hopefully that addresses the questions, and members will see the information coming to the area committees in due course. Thanks, Chair.
Could I ask for a timescale on that, Chair, if I may? Because obviously we're moving towards the recess, and if the information is going to the area committees after the recess, that's obviously a while away. Could we have a bit of confirmation on either getting it before that, or alternatively, what the arrangements will be for that?
The intention, sorry, Chair, the intention would be just to report to the next cycle of area committees. That's my understanding of what's been agreed. The capital fund, the £2 million has been agreed by committee. It's now for officers to implement that and then inform the area committees. So I don't have the dates of the area committees at hand, but it would be the next cycle, Councillor Brown.
Can I ask Michael that we've got assurance though that what we're talking about here will be able to be carried out in the financial year?
Yes, that's absolutely the intention. That's why we moved very quickly once we got the agreement from the council for that additional funding, to move quickly to get the PB exercise undertaken and concluded. And now officers are now working on delivering the programme. So again, going back to the first answer, I have confidence that will be delivered in 21-22.
Chair, if I may presume a little bit on that, I mean, we're all getting, I think, and seeing, a range of difficulties in terms of roads and pavements, things in our own area. I think reasonably clearly, if this is all going to come to us after the recess, that's not terribly satisfactory. I wonder if I can ask for assurance we can get at least the information about the non-PB bit being available to us in local areas before that, before the recess if possible, if that information is now available.
Yeah, so just to clarify, Councillor Brown, you referred to the roads investment programme, the works. Yes, we can give you the list of the projects, and indeed you may have that already, but I'll check with officers. If you haven't, we can assure that it's sent to members, but we do that on an annual basis to make members aware of what's happening within their local area. So I can double check that for you and get that before the area committees, because that's separate to the PB exercise.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. I don't see any other hands raised on this item. Your hand's still raised, Robert. Is that a legacy hand? Right, okay. No other hands been raised. I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. We move on then to item 6, which is capital budget 21-22. And it's on pages 49 to 64. Paul, can you come back on this one?
Okay, thanks, Chair. Now, again, what this paper is doing is setting up the capital programme for the new year, and I'll come back to that in a second. Now, there were already capital programmes approved for both general service and for housing programme. So I've got a wee bit of feedback there. For general services for the housing programme, and the dates of the meetings in which those were approved are given at the foot of page 49. What we have done is to go through and try and get as realistic a picture as possible of the amounts of money and the projects and programmes that are going to deliver during 21-22. Now, if that isn't going to be possible, these things have been moved forward to year 22-23. However, I just stressed that the funding to do those remains secure. So what we've summarised, this is at section 4 on page 50. is that we're now looking at a capital programme of £85.066 million. And what Appendix 1 does, and that's on pages 54 to 56 of the paper, is go through on a project-by-project basis all of the projects that are now included within that capital programme, coming to that figure of £85.066 million. There are a couple of appendices again at the back of that. One of them goes through the additional funded projects which have been added in, and these are by and large as a result of a series of exceptions, and you can see a number of, for example, play area projects that are included there on page 57 and 58 through to 59. Appendix 3 gives a summary of movement from the originally approved list, and what I would draw your attention to within Appendix 3, this is in sections 10 and 12 in that paper, there are two projects which have been approved by committee already, which are also being added in here. One relates to the school at Newton Farm, which was approved by the last executive committee, and another one relates to the replacement of the social work system. It's called the Swiss system, which was approved at the social work committee. So those are added into the programme as well. So section 4.3 covers the spend position up to the 21st of May. So we've spent just over £4 million. That's what we would have expected to spend at that point. The housing programme is in there as well. And what we are talking about there is a programme of £94.36 million, and again at 4.10 it goes through the amount of spend that's been achieved to date through the housing programme. So if I go back to the recommendations that are in there within that paper, it looks for approval of that capital programme that's summarised at Appendix 1. It also looks for approval and the additional borrowing required to fund the extension to Newton Farm and the replacement of that Swiss system, as I referred to a second ago, be approved, and also that we just note the reporting arrangements for the capital programme in the year ahead, as it says there at recommendations 3 and 4. So again, Chair, happy to take any questions on this.
Chair, you're on mute.
Councillor Ross, you're on mute.
I thought I'd be first to do it today so that everybody feels relieved after that. Can I possibly have Councillor Falconer first? I see his hands up, and then Councillor Nelson.
Thanks, Chair. I've got two questions relating to page 56. Social work resources. Replacement care facilities, 6.2 million. What replacement care facilities is that?
Okay, I think I'm off mute now. Listen, that relates to the budgeted spend on the facility at Blantyre. So that's obviously continuing into year 2021-22.
So the actual cost of that was more than 6.2?
Yes, that's the amount of money that we've budgeted to spend in year 2021-22. There was spend, I believe, in 2021, and I need to see the extent of the spend carrying on into 22-23. So there have been analysis of the spend and the budget provided before. Again, I'm happy to redistribute those if members wish.
I'd quite like to see that, Paul. Chair, my second question, the Swiss Plus replacement, the Swiss, as Paul said, it was discussed at the last social work meeting. I just hope it's not the same company that supplied us with the Totally Mobile, but at that last social work meeting had a heady service making it quite clear that the Totally Mobile, which supports care at home, was working, contrary to what I'd heard, was working very well, when in fact 3 days later it crashed, and with team leaders phoning about telling staff to memory how they visited elderly, what people had to visit. It's crashed another twice since. And obviously the Swiss is related to the Totally Mobile because the Swiss also records who visits and when they visit. Is it the same company supplying us as supplying the Totally Mobile?
Okay, so the situation with the Swiss system is that this is going out to open tender, right? So at this point in time, we don't know who's going to bid to replace that system.
Supplementary, Chair, quite quickly. So are you aware of the problems with Totally Mobile?
In terms of the Total Mobile, right, the company who are providing a solution, right, in terms of the detail, right, of these issues that you're talking about, right, Total Mobile was launched on a pilot basis, right, and is then being bedded in across social work resources, across the operation for the entire area. I believe, Councillor Faulkner, that on the whole, the implementation is very successful and it's been very well received by the social workforce.
Right. Right. Alan, can I ask you to take that elsewhere, because it's not really relevant at this point if it's going out to open tender. So I think that's a discussion that we can take up with Paul out with this meeting. If you've got problems there, I think you should relay these problems to Paul so that everybody gets a chance to see what you're talking about. But we'll move on to Richard Nelson just now. Richard.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair. First of all, thanks to Paul and his team. I did have a serious few questions on this paper, Chair, and they did come back and answer them quite well. So first of all, thanks for doing that, because I think it saves some time. First of all, it's just about the leisure centre fees, and again, thanks for giving me that information, Paul. It's good to see that the Larkhall Leisure Centre funding is secured and we will be moving forward. I would just hope we can get that done as a matter of urgency, given we'll be waited some time now. And the second part was just about the play parks and about the developers' contributions, etc. And I know you gave me some information on that. And given that Larkhall is in the community growth area, etc., it's very disappointing to see that we're throwing up houses all over the place in Larkhall, but yet we get no funding for any of our play parks. So I'm happy to take that offline, Chair, but I just wanted to make those comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I don't see any other hands raised on this item, so I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Thanks very much. Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. We move on to item 7, which is additional funding from the Scottish Government, and this is on pages 65 to 68. Paul, again.
So this, as you say, is about additional funding, and you can see on page 67 of your papers, there is a summary of the additional revenue funding that's been received. Our share of a national total of £60 million for education recovery support, an amount of money again from the Scottish Government for summer activities for children and young people, £882,000, and funding for the expansion of free school meals, again from the Scottish Government, coming to £3.2 million. Again, Chair, happy to answer any questions on those.
Thanks very much, Paul. Does any colleague have any questions? I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to item 8, which is the Employee Workforce Monitoring Information, April 2020 to March 21, and that's on pages 69 to 94. And I would ask Kay to give us a report on this, please.
Thank you, Chair. As you say, it's the annual summary of the workforce monitoring information. So in terms of section 4, you can see that our average absence rate for the year is 4.2%, and that's an improvement in comparison with the previous year. And you can also see the impact that COVID has had on the pattern of absence. So, turning to the bullets on the following page, although musculoskeletal and psychological conditions remain our main causes of absence, you can see there's quite a significant decrease in musculoskeletal conditions, and conversely a significant increase in respiratory conditions, which is predominantly due to the impact of COVID. As a marginal impact, we've also had a reduction in stomach-related absences, and we put that down in the main to some of the improved hygiene factors that have come about as a result of the COVID information, but also a bit in terms of reduction in social interaction. If I take out the COVID absence, then the figure for last year is 3.7 for underlying absence that isn't COVID related. You can see the impact continuing at section 5 in terms of occupational health. So it has been a very unusual year. So you can see a fair reduction in terms of physiotherapy support. Now, part of that is related to our reduction in musculoskeletal absence, but it's also related to a point in time when we did not necessarily have access to the service due to lockdown. You can also see an impact in terms of our counselling and CBT referrals. On a similar basis, it was access at one point, but we're also providing a very good virtual service now in most cases. And we've also got a number of other online supports that are available to the workforce. In terms of accidents and incidents, they similarly have decreased over the year. I would put that down predominantly to, again, COVID and lockdown in a number of areas. And in terms of the other impacts that are contained within the report, you can see at section 8, employee development, and quite a significant change over the piece, as a lot of learning was then delivered online, and there is a kind of wider range of content now available on a whole host of new subjects. At section 9, you can see our turnover figure, which I think I've been reporting all year is decreasing, and you can see that in the annual figure. So that figure is 2.4%, and that's come down 1.7% in comparison with the previous year. We are still, however, recruiting, and at section 10, you can see the information regarding the applicants that we've had over the year and the various breakdowns. Asking the committee to note the content of the report, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Kate. Does any colleague have questions? I see there are a couple of hands raised. Richard, can I have you first, and then Councillor McCready.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Kate. Just on page 85 in Appendix 12A, when you've got the record of grievances and the dignity at works, the still in progress numbers look relatively high. I give and take about the COVID situation, but behind those figures is a person, as a member of staff, and these figures seem extremely high to be still in progress. And how are we going to get that to move forward, if you like, to get those numbers down? Because, as I said, behind it is a member of staff and ultimately a human being.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the still in progress, it's a matter of timing. So some of these will be quite recent, so they might not necessarily have been outstanding for a main number of time. I actually had a quick look at the grievances and dignity at works and disciplinary hearings to see how long they're currently taking. So they're averaging somewhere between 2 to 3 months at this point in time, which, depending on the nature of the grievance, if it's complicated, for example, it may take that time to do, but we do encourage everybody to try and resolve these issues very quickly, because we're very well aware, Councillor Nelson, of the impact on individuals through these processes.
Thanks, Chair. Sorry, just a supplementary. It's just that the grievances, if you look at the grievances from April to March 2019-2020, 17 still in progress. That's a period of time, so I get what you're saying, but there's still a period of time. There's 17 members of staff. That's still relatively high, and I would like to see that figure come down to get that at a better level.
If I could maybe clarify, that's for 1920. So for 2021, you can see the still in progress is 2. So it may be, I'll go back and I'll have a wee check, but it might be the end of the previous year that there perhaps was a group grievance, for example, and that's what you're seeing in that, but I can double check that for you.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Richard. Councillor McCready.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just ask on recruitment monitoring, which is on page 91, it looks as though in veterans we're getting lots of them, well, we're getting some of them applying, and we're also quite successful in giving them interviews, but we don't really seem to be recruiting any. There's not much point in interviewing veterans if they're not going to get a job at the end of it. So can I perhaps ask Kay's thoughts on why that's the case and why we're not getting any appointed? Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Kay.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's a feature that we've spotted, and I've asked for some work to be done looking at the unsuccessful applicants. Now, it is a guaranteed interview scheme, so they're guaranteed an interview, but not necessarily guaranteed a job as a result. So we need to look at what is the mismatch between the application and why they weren't successful. So I've commissioned a little bit of work on that, Councillor McCready.
Satisfy your answer, Councillor?
Yeah, we look forward to seeing if there's any progress going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other hands raised, so I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you very much, colleagues. We're now going to move into items for decision. And item 9 is the revenue budget strategy and savings requirement. It's on pages 95 to 110. And I would ask Paul to come back on this report, please.
Thanks, Chair. Again, this is a lengthy report, right? So I'll try and focus on the main points. It's the first paper that we've put to you in preparing the budget strategy for next year, for 2022-23. And at the foot of the first page, it focuses on 6 things that the paper is going to go through in detail. And I'll bring out the highlights in relation to each of those things. Now, the first of them is on government grant estimates. So this is usually the first thing that we cover in our budget paper. And it's the hardest thing to predict. So what you can see within that are sort of 3 main elements which contribute to how we think our grant is going to move next year. So this really provides the cornerstone of how we put together our budget strategy. What we're assuming in there at the moment is a 1% decrease on the previous year's grant allocation. Now that would be a reduction in grant of £5 million. Now that's in line with what we put in our medium to long-term financial strategy when we put that to you and when we refreshed that last year. At the moment, I don't have any basis to move away from that as an estimate. If I did get any indication, I would come back and tell you at a future committee. But at the moment, I'm basing our movement in grant on that £5 million reduction. There's 2 other things that we factor in here in relation to grant. And these are a bit easier to predict, right? And I feel more secure in including these within our estimates. One of them is a movement in grant in respect of how we think movements in population are going to drive our grant moving forward into year 22-23. So what effectively happens is, even though South Lanarkshire's population is increasing, there are other areas in the country where their population is rising faster than ours, and that drags grant away from us towards them. Right, so that's factoring in a cut in grant of just over £1 million. You can see that in section 4.7. I also have to factor in the impact on our grant figure of us getting more council tax income in over the past few years. So what the government does is they adjust the grant figure that councils get in effect to compensate for more council tax income coming in. Right, so that'll lead to a reduction in grant, again just over £1 million at 1.040 million. So what we've done at the end of that first section on government grant is summarise that in a table, which you can see, that's on page 97. And that gives us a total grant reduction coming from those 3 items of £7.1 million. Now, the second section, right, that I've said we would talk about is on other budget movements. Right, so there's a series of things that are covered in there. They are pretty much summarised, right, in a table that you can see at the top of page 98. And what we've gone through there is we've acknowledged that there is more income likely to come in council tax, largely as a result of new properties being built in the area, right, which we expect to see coming on stream for council tax in 22-23. And then we go through these additional expenditure items. Now, the most significant of them, and you can see that from that table at the top of page 98, is this figure of £30.9 million, and that's the reinstatement of temporary solutions used in previous years. Now, the figure that's in there is one that we included in the paper that we brought when we approved the budget for year 2021-22. So what that comes from is the fact that we've had to put together a budget over last year and for a couple of years prior to that, using one-off monies coming from reserves. So what we've said is that doesn't represent a permanent solution in your budget, right? Reserves are a one-off draw. They fill the gap for 1 year and it leaves a gap in succeeding years. And that's where that £30.9 million comes from. And again, I'll come back to how we're looking to address that as we go through the paper. Now, working down that table, that you can see in section 5.7, you can see that £30.9 million. I have put money in there at £7.234 million, which would pay for a pay settlement in 2022-23. We've also factored in money in the line below of £2.15 million, and that's for price increases. And the detail given in the table covers what that is. We're likely to face an increase on the value of our payment for the secondary school modernisation contract. We've put more money in for mainstream school transport because the prices are rising there. And there's also more money going in for social work for children and families in respect of increased costs there. The line beneath that factors in money for funding for priorities, £3.98 million. We're putting in more money to pay for waste management, right? And that's to address pressure on the budget there, and also to pay for more teachers as a consequence of estimates of pupil growth as we move into year 22-23. The three lines at the bottom of that table have got smaller amounts in them. Again, there's money going in there for Leisure and Cultural Trust, revenue consequences of capital. In part, that's to pay for the borrowing on the Newton Primary School. That needs to get factored into the budget. And then there's a £500,000 amount that we're putting in under the heading of other budget items. That's to deal with loan charges. So what these things do is effectively add £46 million in terms of our expenditure budget as we go into year 22-23. So that's the second item that I was going to cover there. The third thing is a summary of that budget gap, and you can see that at the foot of that page in the table that we've got there. So we take the £7.1 million, right, which is the grant reduction referenced a second ago. We reference as well the fact that we will get some more council tax come in. I then bring in that £46 million, which is our additional expenditure items, which I've just described. And there is a figure there of £2.367 million for pay award. Now, you'll remember 2 committees ago when we updated the executive committee about our share of an amount of £40 million. And our share is £2.367 million. What I had to say at that meeting is, I don't know at this point what the pay award is going to be for 2021-22. But we asked that at that meeting, and the committee agreed that it would be prudent to put that £2.367 million aside for that. What I did say at that point is that's just one-off money, right? So that's not necessarily recurring in future years' budgets. So I need to make provision for that when we're putting together the budget for year 22-23. So when we add these things together, what we get to is that total budget gap that you can see at the foot of that table of £54.4 million. Right, so that's a considerable amount of money. It's not that different from the position that we were in last year when we were putting together the 21-22 budget. So budget gap of £54.4 million. The fourth thing that I said I would tell you about, and it's covered in section 7, are the potential solutions that we can put towards this to try and reduce that budget gap. The first of them that you can see at 7.2, it says reserves from loans fund review. And what that relates to is, I go back to this thing that you approved at the committee last year, which was about lengthening the amount of time that we write some of our assets over. And that created a pool of money that we could use over a period of years to try and reduce our budget gap. So that can contribute £27.4 million towards this. The next thing is about the investments that were made in the 2021-22 budget. You'll remember there was £10 million invested on a one-off basis. So that means that as we move into the new year, into 22-23, that's there to contribute to that budget gap, right? So that's a good contribution, right, of £10 million coming from that step that you took. I'm also hoping that we can underspend against our loan charges this year, just again by managing how we borrow across the year and using our cash balances. And you'll recall from the first paper that I did, I've got significant cash balances because of the COVID money that we were passed to. So that means I can go for longer without borrowing, and that takes our loan charge figure down. So we can contribute £1.65 million towards that. Council tax collection, when I look at the year end, I think is better than we expected, and I think we can up our expectations by £1 million as we go forward into 22-23. So these things are all contributing to reducing that budget gap. At section 7.7, I'm outlining a step that can be taken to reduce that gap, and that's putting up council tax. Now, the figure that we factored in there is £4.882 million. That's the amount of money that we were compensated by the government for as we went into year 2021-22 for implementing a council tax freeze. Right, so we're being prudent, right, in the amount of money that we're putting in respect of council tax, and we're assuming that it would be no more than that, right, and that would equate to a 3.5% increase in council tax. What I would stress is this paper does not, right, approve putting up council tax. What the paper goes through to is the fact that if we take these things into account, we can reduce that budget gap from £54.4 million to the figure that you can see at 7.8 in the paper, which is £9.417 million. It does note at 7.9, if council tax isn't increased, the requirement would be just under £14.3 million. So that works its way through that budget gap, right? And shows how those corporate solutions can be applied against that. So the fifth section that I said I would talk to you about is about the summary and next steps. And that just pulls together that position again and gives a bit of an indication as to where we go next with this. So what section 8.1 notes is that budget gap of £9.4 million, and it's proposed that officers commence work on a package of savings to that value. The point is made there that we are already looking at options for management and operational savings at present, and that's picked up again at section 9.1. And we make the point that that exercise is underway. That could include changes as to how we do things, how we use technology, and how we deploy our staff. And it also picks up at the end of section 9.1 specific areas that we're focusing on at the moment to look at how we do that. We then go on just to look at the longer term picture and the fact that this is going to tie in with a new council plan, right, which will be launched in 2022, and it points towards an enhanced level of engagement with communities as we put together that council plan. Now, this is what we covered in the members' briefing, which is still available online, that took place last week. And again, it says at the top of page 101, part of that engagement is going to be about establishing which services are important to and valued by communities, and that's going to be used to inform strategic planning and budgeting processes moving forwards. And there are also other things that as a committee and as a council you have approved and directed towards over the past year in particular. So we're pointing there towards things like community wealth building and the fact that that is an agenda, a new council plan. Other things, for example, the sustainability and climate change agenda, and things like place-based approaches in 20-minute neighbourhoods. And the degree of engagement in all of these things is going to point towards a strategic direction for the future with the council, which is going to have to inform our budget strategy. So in terms of the council plan and the process around that, and again, this was covered last week at that briefing, that's picked out in the table that's there at section 9.4. Now, the paper finishes off by talking about reinstatement and again covering the impact of using amounts from reserves and one-off solutions and how that can be addressed as we move forward. That's covered in section 10, and that links in with the section on reserves that's covered at 11 in the paper. You see, going back to recommendations, which you can see on page 95, I'm looking for approval of that budget strategy, right, and acknowledging that budget gap of £54.4 million before solutions get applied. Also, the corporate solutions, including the use of reserves, resulting in a revised budget gap of £9.4 million be approved, right, and the next steps, including the identification of the £9.4 million be agreed. So again, Chair, happy to take any questions.
You're on mute, Chair.
Thanks very much, Maureen. No, thanks, Paul, for that very clear and concise explanation of the report. I know it's early days yet, but I'm sure some of the colleagues will have questions on it. Alec, I see your hands raised.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, as you say, I'm never sure whether it's because I don't understand them. Paul is just so good at explaining the figures, but it all looks so straightforward. The one point in this, though, is recommendation 3 of only identifying £9.4 million worth of savings at this time. If we were to agree a zero rise in council tax, there would be insufficient savings. And it also, even if we do agree a higher level of council tax rise, we've got no choices at all. And therefore, would it not be prudent to identify a significantly higher level of savings that could be made, so that one, we have a choice in the level of council tax we wish to impose, and secondly, have a choice in different types of savings that we could make.
Paul?
Okay, Chair, I suppose I can come back and answer that part as best I can, right? So I go back to the point that I made when I was presenting the paper. The paper doesn't ask, right, at this point for an increase in council tax. Your point is right, and it's fair, Councillor Allison, and it says it's 7.9. If the council chooses not to increase council tax, the requirement would be in excess of £14 million, right? But I suppose in considering the paper, members are going to have to weigh up the likelihood of yourselves either electing not to freeze council tax, or, for example, the government replicating the position that it did for year 2021-22 and providing money to councils to freeze council tax. So I suppose the likelihood, right, of these different events and how you weigh up and take a judgment on those, you're right, feeds directly into the level of savings that we need to go and find. The point I would make at the end is, if we don't assume a level of council tax increase, you are asking officers to go down a path of developing savings options that are effectively 50% higher than they would be if we assumed a level of council tax increase. And that does represent a fundamental difference in the shape of the package that we end up putting before you when we get to the autumn.
Thanks very much, Paul. I mean, it is still early days, isn't it? Alec? Yeah.
Supplementary, Paul, yeah, that is right, what you say, but that is then a councillor's decision, whether they wish to make these fundamental savings or increase council tax. If we don't have the option, by only identifying savings without option and raising council tax by the level indicated, not agreed, but indicated in the paper, it gives us no choice. Does not mean to say that we're going to take these savings. It does not mean to say that we are going to take a council tax rise or not. But by having a level of saving that allows us to make these fundamental policy decisions is the role of the council. And I think we need to see what they are so we can take those decisions ourselves.
Thanks, Alec. The point I was trying to make is it's still very early days in this process, Alec, and we could always come to that decision once we get more information as we go forward. Is that not correct, Paul?
In terms, as the position develops, right, if I become aware of changes, right, and you're right, there are a number of changes that could happen, I would make the committee aware of them, right, immediately, right. So if there was something that changed around forecasts in government funding, for example, other streams of funding coming in, a fundamental change, for example, in our estimates of expenditure, I would report back to you with them immediately. I suppose the strategy that you've got at the moment is as best we can see it at this point, which is at the early stages of the budget process.
Thanks very much, Paul. Alec, I'm happy to let the recommendations go through the way they are at the present time. If you're not happy, then I suggest you put something forward. But in the absence of that, I'm going to ask that the recommendations be approved at this time.
I'll second, Chair.
I'll leave it at this time.
Thanks, Alec. Are we agreed on the recommendations?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thanks very much. Can we go on to item 10, which is the land and property transfers and disposals? These are in page 111 to 114. And Danny, can you give us a report on this, please?
Yep, sure. Thanks for that, Chair. This is just a standard land and property transfers report through which committee has been asked this morning to declare the 3 small areas of land which are noted in Appendix A on page 113 of your paper surplus. If you go to section 3 in the report, it notes the operational detail which is around these transactions that are being put forward. And on Appendix A, then it lists the 3 small parcels of ground which are adjacent to 50 Annbank Street in Larkhall, 83 Mackin Road, Larkhall, and 40 McDermott Drive in Hamilton. And the adjacent owners are seeking to purchase these areas of land for use as additional garden ground. So if I take committee back to the recommendations, they are being asked this morning to declare the 3 areas of land surplus to allow negotiations for their disposal to conclude. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Danny. Does any colleague have any questions? Don't see any hands raised. I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to...
So most members will be familiar with the background to the cross-party working group on the review of our trust. And this would be either through being on the cross-party working group itself or through the round of presentations that myself and David Booth, the General Manager of the Trust, gave earlier in the year. However, as a brief reminder, the cross-party working group was agreed at the full council and at the executive committee back in 2019. The terms of reference was also agreed for the group, and these are set out at paragraph 3.3 of the report. And just to highlight that the overriding purpose of the work of the group was to define the ask of the council of the trust. The work of the group commenced in July 2019 and concluded its work in May 2021. At the final meeting of the group on the 19th of May, it was agreed that its findings would be reported to the executive committee and then onto the full council, and that this would focus on the following matters. Firstly, governance arrangements. Secondly, pricing arrangements. Thirdly, to look to strengthen the links between the trust and the community planning partnership. However, at the same time, the working group concluded that any review and changes to the asset base would not be progressed. However, opportunities and capacity for community asset transfers should be considered further, with a view to increasing community capacity and capabilities for engaging within that actual transfer process. So from these conclusions, section 4 through to section 8 of the report sets out the details of the case for change under those 4 aspects, what those changes would look like, and an indication of the timescales for taking these matters forward. I think it's just worth highlighting, Chair, and also members, that this report to the Executive Committee and then on to the full Council is not necessarily signing off on the details of what these matters may look like. You know, for example, the exact number of board members for the Trust, the time period that they would be board members, the recommended pricing for concessionary prices. But what we're hoping through this report is to seek endorsement from this committee, and then later on this morning, approval at the full council for the strategic approach set out in the report. And if we get support for this, Chair, this will then provide a basis for officers, along with the trust, to work up the details, which will then be reported back to committee for approval. And within the report, you'll see some of the timescales around pricing. Well, if we do get support, to come back to the council in August with recommendations on concessionary pricing and on governance. We would hope to have that in place by the new financial year next year, which will be coming back to committee during this year to seek that approval. The one exception to this is the increased involvement of the Trust General Manager in the CPP board. The General Manager is now a formal part of the board, so that is actually in place just now, and I think there is consensus that is a good thing, so that will just continue. All of this, Chair, is summarised in section 9 of the report, and also within the table at paragraph 9.1, which in effect is an action plan, if it is supported by the committee and also the council, an action plan for officers to move matters forward. I would add that throughout the process, we have sought to keep the Trust Board informed of the work of the group, our union colleagues, and of course, the staff at the Trust. And I think, broadly speaking, there is support for the general direction coming out of the cross-party working group. But I think more than anything, Chair, is a keenness now to move forward after all this time. So I wasn't going to go through it in any much more detail, Chair. So I simply would ask the committee to approve the recommendations at section 2.1, which in effect seeks to move the matter onto the full council for consideration later this morning for approval, and happy to take any questions, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Does any colleague have any questions on the item? I see Joe has his hand raised. Joe?
Thanks, Chair. I want to just come back to some issues that did come up in the working group proceedings, partly for my own benefit, but also just for the benefit of the committee. I appreciate there may have been movement in this. Can I ask, and I think Michael would be the appropriate person to answer the question, I assume it is still the case that SLLC is operating under an emergency repairs only position. Is that the case?
So in terms of repairs, yes, they're doing what's required to be undertaken to maintain properties, but also working with our housing and tech colleagues on more significant repairs. Councillor Fagan.
Okay, can I ask then, and could you remind me, because this did come up in one of our conversations, what the current repair backlog is estimated to be? The figure that I have provided to me is the cost of ensuring that the Trust estate remains wind and watertight, and also just to bear in mind, the Trust manages on behalf of the council, the properties remain within the council's control. For the next 5 years is estimated to be in the region of £10 to £12 million to maintain the properties in their current condition. And you've just alluded to, but my final question would be, how would the split of that £10 to £12 million, how would the balance of the repair bill be divided between the Trust itself and the council as the owners of the properties?
I don't have that details in front of me, Councillor Fagan, but what I would offer as a comment is that the vast majority of the maintenance rests with the council, and there's a much smaller fund that sits with the Trust. But I don't have that exact split.
Right, okay. No, that's I'm happy with that for just now, Chair.
Thanks very much. Councillor McAdams.
Thanks, John. I just wanted to speak to this item. I think that there was some good things that came out of the cross-party working group. I think the end of the pernicious boundary charge, which affected golf more than any other discipline, and also a fairer and more flexible pricing policy, which will enable South Lanarkshire Leisure and Culture to more properly compete against the private outlets, and also to be more competitive in offering packages to people entering or re-entering the leisure and sports market. So that's a positive. But it would be remiss if I didn't remind everybody why there was a vote at full council to set up the cross-party working group. It was in the wake of what can only be described, and it's no offence against Councillor Watson, because I have the greatest respect for him in regards to the work that he does in his community, but I'll call it the David Watson shambles, not naming him, but just basic, well, I am naming him, but this is what happened. And this is when the administration had overseen.
Monique,
no, let me finish, John, and please don't cut me off.
Monique,
John, I'm speaking.
I don't. No,
John,
Monique,
I'm going to finish what I'm saying.
Point of order.
Let me finish.
Point of order.
Well, you can have your point of order once I've finished speaking. What I was saying was,
Monique, I'm stopping you. Monique, I'm stopping you speaking.
Sorry, John, it's actually not.
Point of order, Chair.
So we're doing away from freedom of speech, because the last time this happened, what happened was I got muted. And then
Pauline, could you put Councillor McAdams on mute, please? Thank you. Listen, I'm not going to allow this discussion. This discussion is on something that took part a long time ago and bears no relation to what we're speaking about today. So you can make any other point you want, Monique, but I'm not taking any comments on Councillor Watson's situation on a previous time. So if you're going to continue with that, then I'm not going to allow you to speak. Simple as that. Okay, so if that's your only contribution, I'm moving on to the next speaker, which is Councillor Allison.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the paper fairly reflects, I think, the work of the Working Party. There is a couple of things in it. Just first of all, for clarification, some people, when they read things, take a different interpretation on them. For instance, the board members, there will still be representation by council members on that board. And can employees be part of the board, etc., including a trade union representative? There were others that Michael has already clarified regarding the council company. He's explained that to us. Thank him very much for that. But finally, the biggest point I think I have is that one of the main issues within all of this is an increased activity in the asset transfers. And there seems to be a variation at the moment in how effectively that system is working. Yes, I am aware that we have recently taken the decision to employ someone to take that on board, which is very much welcomed. But what I think we actually need to be very much aware of ongoing is that the asset transfer policy, I will call it, is actually working. Because there is no point in having that as a main part of this and not being able to make use of it. And I would suggest that we look at a policy within the council and a structure of how that is actually happening that is unique to ourselves, so that we can ensure that all of these can be taken forward. And I'd look for those assurances, I presume through Michael, but thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Ali. You raised this at the leaders' meeting on Monday. I quite agree with you. We really need to make sure that our policy is clear and concise. The new role that has been taken on, I'm sure, will help with that. And I'll bring in Michael just now, just to give us some assurance that this is the way forward. Michael?
Yeah, happy to do so, Chair. Just for information for members, is that we currently have 36 live inquiries from community groups who have expressed interest on taking on some of the property. So there's a reasonable basis there. I think reflecting on the work of the group that's a good basis, but it's also just to increase that capacity, that capabilities, and maybe moving that at greater speed, but also looking at the condition of the properties to make sure that they are in an appropriate condition to pass over to an appropriate community group. And you'll see from the table at 9.1, that has a specific action Councillor Allison's absolutely right. There's been further resources put to that. So I think one of the real positive things coming out of the cross-party working group is a heightened interest in the awareness for community asset transfer and the heightened importance directed to officers to push that on. So, of course, give that assurance, Chair, and that's something which collectively as a corporate management team will move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I also see that Danny has his hand raised. Danny, do you want to come in on the same item?
Thanks, Chair. It was probably just to reiterate what Michael was picking up there. So Councillor Allison makes some valid points when you go through that too, and it's something we've been aware of. Then we were looking at how we're going to make sure that we have got the right resources in place to help asset transfers to go over the line in future and to do so timely. So there is that part where we also recognise there's a varied ability of the varied groups that come to us as well, just in terms of being able to take things forward too. And as well as so we will do the bit that we will look at, what repair requirements are there required to properties to get them ready for asset transfer potentially, and also what specific supports do groups need, and that will vary from group to group. And it's what specific supports do they need, and what can we put in place to make sure that we get them over the line, and we get them over the line quickly too. So that is something that we are making sure that is in place in terms of their new process and procedure, Councillor Allison.
Thanks very much, Danny. Alec, does that give you some reassurance?
Yeah, thanks to both officers for that. I think it is important that we had that down on record. Regarding the first two other points, I know they're small, regarding board members, etc., council members still being on there, etc. I think just for the record, I would like to, and also staff, if that could just be put on the record as well.
Okay, thanks, Alec. Monique, I see that your hand is still raised. If you're going to be talking on another subject, I don't mind, but if you go back on the same subject before, I'm just going to cut you off again, okay? If you've got something to say on another subject, Monique.
John, I'm not a child of yours, so don't dare try and treat me like one. I'm actually your opposition, okay? So I'm not meant to agree with you. That's not what my job is. I wasn't elected to agree with you.
Chair, point of order.
So that I can represent my constituents. Again, because it's really rude. I've now put it in the chat because you stopped me from being able to speak.
Pauline, could you mute Councillor McAdams, please? Thanks very much. I'm not taking this. I'm the chair of this committee, and I'll decide what's relevant for this committee, and you can take up with another body if you don't think that's relevant. Councillor Loudon.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, can we have some clarity on what we're supposed to use the chat for? I thought chat was muted so that people weren't able to put points in it, and that it was only for the purpose of being able to contact if there was an issue or something. Can we have some clarity on that, please?
Pauline.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we do state at the start of the meeting that there are the chat is used for technical issues and simply to let the clerk know if you're leaving the meeting. Those are the only legitimate reasons for using the chat.
Thanks very much, Councillor Loudon. Cleland, can I bring you in here?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to remind all members that the Chair's decision is final. When a point of order is raised by another member, the person who's speaking should stop, refer back to the Chair, and the Chair will bring that point of order forward. But just to remind, it's the Chair's decision. I was going to cover the point about the use of chat, but I think Pauline's covered that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cleland. Councillor Fagan.
Thanks, Chair. And I suppose, I think we do respect the role of the Chair in this. Could I just ask, and you could consider it a point of order if appropriate, I'm not asking you to comment on the situation Councillor McAdams raised. Could I just understand the reasons why that has been ruled out as an item for discussion?
Simply, I don't think it's an item that's relevant to this committee or the work of the cross-party working group or the decisions we're taking today, and that's my decision. Thanks very much, Joe. I see that we have Councillor Allison.
Sorry, John, it's just back to the question asked, just for clarification, that members of council and staff can still be board members, or whatever they're called, of SLLC.
Yep, Alec, sorry, Michael, would you like to come back on that?
Yep. So probably for other members, they benefit. There is a union representative who's a board member and also an employee who's a board member and has been since it was established. I would have to say that our external advisor says that's an unusual situation, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not appropriate. As I said during the presentation report, the details will be worked through, and if the council wishes to maintain, have an employee representative and a union representative, that is within our gift to do so. So I think, as Councillor Allison has said, just for noting for the record, that would be a preference of his, and we can work that through when we come back with the details. But that has provided a useful input for employees and for the union colleagues, I would have to say, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Are you okay with that, Alec? Fine. I can see Robert's hand up. Robert?
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. Just a slightly different point, if I may. The community asset transfer thing, I wonder if I can just seek a bit of clarity on that, because when this was being discussed before, this was related to certain of the council's, the leisure trust properties, if you like, that were less used or whatever, and they were categorised in terms of the discussion we had at an earlier point. Now, manifestly, you ain't going to sell off, Hamilton Town House or something like that in the context of this. What are the kind of criteria, if you like, for looking at what would be suitable for community asset transfer, and at what point in the process would this come to committee for some sort of approval, nod of approval, or otherwise? I think it's quite important we get that aspect of it right as well.
Thanks, Robert. Michael?
So, Chair, I'm not involved in the details of the process itself, but what I would say is that I think you're right. It's a very good example, but probably quite an extreme example where a community would approach either the council or the trust to take over an asset. And as a council and also as a trust, we have to take a view if that was absolutely core to the delivery of our services and whether it would be appropriate to pass that over to the community. So that's one test. The other test is the actual capabilities of the group itself. They may be well intended, they may be well placed, but have they got an appropriate and sustainable business plan to help take forward the property and maintain the property and deliver the services? The third aspect is, whilst it would be run by the community, there still has to be a wider community access to it as well. And I know that through the work of the cross-party working group, there was some issues about how a particular asset could just be used exclusively for one purpose. So there's three kind of broad aspects there, Councillor Brown, and ultimately it would come back to the council to transfer that property to the community. So that's the three broad themes and tests that we would consider to come back to committee on it. So hopefully that broadly answers the question.
Chair, that's very, very, very helpful response, particularly the last point, because I think the question of wider community access is going to arise in a number of situations where there's a main function, if you like, but there's also the issue of current users and other people that might be sort of involved in that. That's really quite important to be conscious of as we go forward here. Thanks very much, Chair.
Robert, I'll bring in Danny, because I'm sure he has an interest in this as well, because it's really a crossover between both housing and community enterprise, how we go about this. Danny, would you like to come in on that last comment as well?
Yeah, sure, Chair. And probably Michael's covered them anyway when it gets to these points, but just in terms of community empowerment, Councillor Brown, the community can make an application for asset transfer of any of our assets. Then it's for us then to do an assessment of that within a specified timescale, and then report the findings back and come back to that. And like, for example, at Housing and Technical Resources Committee next week, then we have got some of the outcomes of some community asset transfer requests being passed to committee for consideration. So that's one thing that it goes, and it's up to the community then to push forward what they're interested in. And the other part is just in terms of our general asset base, that when we go through our general asset management plans and we look at our properties for the year, again, going back into what we spoke about in the land and property transfers report, if the council has got buildings or properties which it thinks are no longer required for operational purposes, then we can get to that bit where we would put them into the corporate land bank and make them available for disposal. And that would either be for sale, for lease potentially, or for community asset transfer, and they're published in the council's website.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. I see no further hands raised, so I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to item 12, which is the Glenglown Primary School Extension full business case, and that's on pages 125 to 130. And I would ask Michael to give us a report on this, please.
Okay. Thanks, Chair. So from previous reports to committee, members will be aware of City Deal projects and that our community growth areas are a single project, albeit it relates to 4 areas, and they are East Kilbride, Newton, Hamilton and Larkhall. This report relates specifically to Larkhall and a project to extend Glengowan Primary School. Just by way of background, the strategic and outline business cases for Larkhall Community Growth Area have been through the approval process of both the Council and the City Deal Cabinet, and this provides the basis for bringing forward this final business case, which is the first one for Larkhall. The proposal is the extension and internal changes to the primary school, and this will provide 3 additional classrooms, increasing the capacity of the school from 271 to 361, and also provide a new nursery for up to 48 children. This, along with other educational facilities in Larkhall, will meet the need for additional pupil and nursery places as the community growth area continues to be developed. The executive summary of the final business case is set out in Appendix 1 for members' information. If this is approved by committee, the matter will be reported to the City Deal Project Management Office for consideration. Given the level of funding involved, this will mean that it's delegated to the City Deal officers for approval as opposed to the Cabinet, albeit it will be reported to the Cabinet for noting in due course, just in terms of monitoring. If this is all forthcoming, it is anticipated that the extension will be completed by August 2022 for the new term. So with that, Chair, I would ask members to approve the recommendations at paragraph 2.1 of the report, and of course, happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. I see that Richard, you have your hand up, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Michael, for that report, and it's a welcome report to actually see some money actually being spent within Larkhall, which has been calling out for a long time for some money to be spent there. I don't know who's laughing, but so, you know, it's good to see some money being spent there. It's well deserved for Larkhall, as I said historically already, about the houses that have been built in Larkhall and that community growth area. And going forward, I think as we get the new leisure centre, as the money's now been secured, also putting forward on that is also the pressure that it puts on GP practices, dentists and other community services, which is never mentioned in here. So welcome start to that community growth, and that's money being spent within Larkhall, and I'm grateful for that, and so will the community going forward, and hopefully we can see further investment in Larkhall as a matter of urgency. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Richard, for those comments. I don't see any other hands raised, so I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you very much. We now move on to item 13, which is Glasgow City Region Climate Adaptation Strategy, and that's on pages 131 to 138. And Michael, if you could come back on that one, please, as well.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. So I'll briefly just take members through the report. Members may recall that a public consultation was undertaken on the draft adaptation strategy at the end of 2020, and this was reported to the Climate Change and Sustainability Committee back in the 10th of February. where we offered up some comments to that consultation, which was approved by the committee. So following that consultation exercise, the draft strategy was updated to take account of these responses and then was ultimately presented to the City Region Cabinet on the 1st of June 2021 for approval. The strategy was approved at that meeting with the action that it would be submitted for endorsement from partners at their respective committees and boards prior to the launch of the strategy planned for the 29th of June, which is next week. So the purpose of this endorsement process is to increase the awareness of the strategy amongst partners and in turn begin to influence how partners go about their plan making and service delivery. Just as a comment, Chair, this would have naturally been reported back to the Climate Change and Sustainability Committee for consideration, given that we reported it back in February. However, the next meeting of the committee is not until the 25th of August, not the 21st as I put in the report, so apologies for that error, which is after the launch. So really, because of that timing, it was considered important that this matter was reported to the Executive Committee, and also bearing in mind that the Executive Committee members make up the Climate Change Committee as well, prior to the launch, so that members are aware of it before it actually hits the press and other media sources. So with that, Chair, members will see from the committee report that the strategy is framed around 3 interlinked aspects: 11 interventions, or aims, you may wish to call them, 5 place-based approaches, and also 16 flagship actions that are set out in an action plan. Taken together, these interlinked matters seek to put in place a high-level approach that will position the City Region on how to recognise that adaptation is required, given that mitigation action will no longer prevent the impact of climate change, and in doing so, build the region's social, economic, environmental resilience to climate change. As with all matters related to climate change, as members will be aware, this will require a step change in how the public and private sectors work, how we work together to bring forward tangible changes in projects, but will also require consideration on how we finance such works. The purpose, objectives and aims of the strategy are consistent with the Council's ambitions to contribute to addressing climate change impacts. And whilst the strategy by its nature is a very high level plan, it does provide the necessary framework for all partners to work collectively together, and from this provide a basis to bring forward project interventions. And it is on that basis, Chair, that it is considered appropriate for the committee to endorse the strategy and action plan. In terms of next steps, these are set out in the report, but I would highlight that this strategy and the flagship actions and the wider contributions will inform the Council's sustainability, development and climate change strategy that's currently been updated. So, as I said at the beginning, this strategy will hopefully inform all partners' plan-making exercise. And just lastly, Chair, the Council has also been asked to continue its financial support to the partnership through to 2025-26, and this support will allow for the implementation, monitoring and reporting of the strategy. The current partnership contribution is approximately £9,500 per annum, and therefore the approximate cost over 5 years would just be over £47,000, and that would be met from existing budgets. So with that, Chair, I would ask members to approve the recommendations at paragraph 2.1 of the report, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. I don't see any hands raised. Is there any colleague that has a question? Nope. I'm going to move the recommendations.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Fine. We're going to move on now to item 14, which was marked down as an item for decision. It's actually an item for noting. It's the South Lanarkshire Antisocial Behaviour Strategy, pages 139 to 177. Can I ask Danny to comment on this, please? Danny.
Thanks for that, Chair. So this report is looking for committee to note the progress on the first annual review of the Antisocial Behaviour Strategy for 2019 to 23. And that covers the 17th month period from the strategy being approved by Executive Committee in November 2019 through to March 2021. The strategy itself, as you'll see from the papers, is constructed around 6 strategic outcomes, which we've listed in the paragraph 3.3 of the report. And these were formed from an analysis of the key antisocial behaviour issues that had been reported through the community safety partners during the period leading up to the development of the strategy. As noted in paragraphs 3.4 and 3.5, then, the implementation and monitoring of the strategy itself is undertaken by the ASBIG group, which also looks at current issues and trends so that they can make a determination of what else needs to be covered in the review and potentially either added to or removed from the strategy. So, in terms of the review, then, there are 42 measures and actions contained within the strategy document, and using the kind of RAG indicators arrangements, 32 of these have been assessed as being green, 2 have been assessed as amber, 4 red, and 4 are going to be reported later. And the tables that are in section 4.3 of the report pick out some of the progress highlights against each of the 6 strategic outcomes. Appendix 1, which is attached to the paper, also provides full details against each of the measures and actions that are contained within the strategy. So that gives members a whole lot more detail against each of them. As members will no doubt appreciate, over the course of the last year or so, the restrictions that have been put in place because of COVID, they've had an impact on our efforts to take forward some of the actions to tackle antisocial behaviour. It'll come as no surprise either, they've also impacted on the types and volumes of antisocial behaviour that we have been experiencing across the council, and again that's reflected in the appendix, in the outcomes and the figures that have came through. What I would say though is, in response to these particular issues that were coming forward, and I think this is a point to recognise, we've got a really strong partnership in place, and that's not just across council resources. We've got a really good partnership in place with other partners, including Police Scotland, with Fire and Rescue, with the ADP too. So we've got a good core there, and they are kind of looking at trends, looking at issues that are coming through, and they are getting solutions and good solutions that are in place to make best use of our resources and to make most effective use of our resources too. So in response to the issues that we were facing over the course of the last year, some of the good work that we did, and I'm just picking out some of the things from the appendix, some of our preventative measures that we previously delivered in a face-to-face way, thinking that going through the school play, Is This Me? Well, the Arkeen Theatre Group, we got them to do that in a digital version. We've put it online. So that's locked in now. It's done in digital. It's been rolled out to schools, and we've got that, which means that can then be passed out to schools, and it can be delivered at a time which is suitable to the school itself rather than fitting into the theatre company schedule. So that's a positive. And then once that's locked in and we've got that, then that only needs refreshed and updated. So therefore, that's potentially an even better way of working that's come out of that. And we also developed a number of other partnership initiatives to deal with domestic noise and public disorder. And these are given a wee bit more detail in the appendix in page 150 of your papers. And that was at a point in time, probably about a year ago, when we were consuming a lot of resources, both within the council and in our partner agencies, particularly Police Scotland. We're dealing with antisocial behaviour issues out in the communities, and we were consuming a lot of resources. And it was the bit that then we did sit down and think, right, okay, proactively we can continue to work in this way, but that's not giving us a good outcome because we're constantly reacting. So how can we stem that flow? How we can get in front of it? And you'll see then the highlights of the initiative that we put in place. We went out over a number of weekends and we targeted hotspots. So we looked at the data that was coming in, we analysed that data, we determined then where we needed to be, when we needed to be there, and we stemmed that flow, and that was very successful. And I think that was a good way of working too, and that's something that we constantly work with our partner agencies to try and make sure that we are coming up with good solutions and that we're making best use of our collective resources. So whoever's best placed to tackle something, they're the person that, that's tasked to do it. So going forward, then the report also notes that the partners are currently considering to deal with, there's some emerging issues that have come up over the last couple of months really as well. And one of these relates to football related flags, bunting and signage. And I have met myself with the divisional commander from Police Scotland as well as a number of local inspectors to discuss the issues that were reported to the council over that period as well, and to also look at the data and the analytics that came in through Police Scotland, so that we can get that full picture then of what was happening across the area, and then have a look at what can we do in the future, or what action can be taken, and what has that told bodies. So that's a wee bit of work that's in train, and we've still to go through. And another piece of work that we're also looking at is for groups gathering in remote wooded areas, consuming alcohol or drugs and littering. And that's something that the partners are working together with just now. That's something that's just become a recent issue, and we're working through to find what is the best solution to deal with that. And if there are any longer term issues that come out from either of these issues, or indeed anything else that comes up across the course of the year, then we'll take them forward and include them in future reviews of the strategy. So in summary then, I'd like to just take members back to the recommendations in the report and just ask that progress is noted with this annual review, and thereafter it will be presented to the Safer South Lanarkshire Board in September this year for noting. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Danny, for that full report. I see Richard and Robert have their hands up. Richard.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Danny, for that. Report's very well received, and I appreciate these are just for noting. And I'm sure the rest of my colleagues will agree that any antisocial behaviour and how it affects our communities. What I would have liked to have seen within the paper, Danny, is about how the housing offers are done and how that can impact on our communities. And I think sometimes people are put into areas that may not be suitable for them, and then it's trying to get them moved from there, and the issues that you then have with the police, antisocial behaviour, and yourselves at housing to try and get somebody moved. And I think if a wee bit more work was done at the front end of that, we certainly wouldn't have those challenges at the back end, and maybe having somebody placed in a better area or not that area. And part of that is looking at, one of the concerns I've had, and I'm sure Daniel will agree with me, is that when you look at an area where you've put a family in, that area has not changed in maybe 30 years, and then you put a family in, you certainly see the change in the atmosphere and in the community itself by that one person getting in, but that upsets the whole community. So I think if a wee bit more work was done, a wee bit more cognizance was done, we could certainly iron out some of those issues at the front end, Danny.
Can I bring Danny back in on that, Danny?
I understand the kind of points that you're making, Councillor Nelson. Come back in it. I can certainly assure you that it's not our intention when we go through our allocations policy that we are letting houses and are putting people into areas that we think are going to create as a problem. That doesn't help the community. Certainly doesn't help our service either. And we do carefully go through our lets prior to making them to try and ensure that there are no issues. That said, we can't guarantee the behaviour of any resident across, and I'm not just talking about tenants, any resident, and how things may change over time as well. So it is something that we do give careful consideration to make sure that we're giving the right lets, and we're making the right lets to make sure communities are stable. Part of the work that we are engaging with elected members with next week, and we'll get through that with the kind of housing leads for each of the groups, is looking at our kind of draft temporary accommodation strategic plan too, which looks at the temporary accommodation that we've got in areas too, and it will look at to make sure that we've got the right accommodation in the right areas and that we are putting the right supports. And again, that it's ongoing work that's undertaken through the Rapid Rehousing Transition Plan for the like as well, to make sure again that when we're putting families into areas or we're putting individuals into areas, that we've got the right wraparound supports in place to make sure that that tenancy can be sustained by the individual or the family, and also to make sure that there is stability in the neighbourhood. So that is a piece of work, and it's something we will continue to look at, issues that are arising, if anything's coming from tenancies, to see what we can learn. So I would give you that assurance.
Okay, Richard.
Thanks.
I see Robert.
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. Just echoing Richard's point, first of all, if I may, it may be just my impression anecdotally, but we seem to be getting an increased number of neighbour dispute type problems emerging. Maybe it's the aftermath of COVID, maybe it's other things, I don't know, where the complaint is almost always one of slowness of being able to deal with it. Now, I appreciate the problems, court actions, and maybe the lack of remedies at an earlier point. But I wonder if that's something we can maybe just have a closer look at, as to whether there's anything we can do to speed up or to deal more effectively with the procedures there to protect. There's all very well saying stability of communities. The issue really is quite often the kind of sanctity of people's own home lives, if you like, comes into it. The point I was going to make, though, before Richard made his thought was related to the weekend events after the Scotland-England match, and also towards the end of term. We certainly had in our area quite an increased number of incidents in the parks, outside some of the pubs, things of that kind, which you might perhaps well expect. We also get, I think, an annual thing when the schools break up of a number of young people gathering in parks with a bit too much alcohol available to them and things of that kind. Now, these are ongoing steady problems that arise from time to time. And I wonder if when Danny's group is looking at the issue of football flags and various other things like that, that these sort of issues could be taken on board as well. I appreciate there's no total answer, there's no magic wand to these things, but they are regular events which cause a lot of agitation. And I just wonder whether we can get a more effective response, because the response I had from the police at the weekend's events were really that they couldn't tackle the stuff in the park because they were dealing with all these incidents outside the pubs and things that were taking place at the same time. The 101 number was stored out, and therefore people were having the frustration or not getting answers either. And then if they did, there was a lack of police resource to be able to sort of tackle it. Now, it's not altogether response, it's also the proactive stuff. Can we have a general look at that issue and see if there are things we can do to actually provide a better response for the public's safety and interest in that one? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm sure comments will be noted, Robert. Councillor Wardhall, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, it was page 142, the item at the top, strategic item 4. I'm looking at the figures there, and nearly 4,000 fly tipping occurrences and 20 notices were issued. That's about 0.005%. I would question whether or not that the man hours and the time that went into that actually justified it. But there is a more important point. Litter and waste disposal are a council responsibility. Now, we can say that people are irresponsible when they do it and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, it's a cost to the council which we have to take on, and we have to take it on in a way which minimises the amount of fly tipping and minimises the cost of the waste, but minimises the cost of the council. It's a difficult problem. But I think there's a case for a review, if you like, of the whole issue of fly tipping, waste disposal. I mean, some of you will remember that some years ago when curbside charges were introduced for waste uplift, there was a projection made that making charges for uplifts would cost or would generate 1.8 million, which was Mickey Mouse because it never came anywhere near that. And what it did do, it brought in a lot more fly tipping, and the fly tipping has got worse since then. I think there needs to be a comprehensive review of, dealing with waste, which would include discharging at the curbside, which is a lot cheaper. I don't know what those 4,000 cases cost to uplift, but I'm sure it was a lot less than it would have been had there been planned uplifts at the curbside. I think we need to take a comprehensive review of is charging increasing fly tipping, and if it is, why do we do it? And I think there are also questions about the charging at waste disposal sites and, in fact, the operation at some of the disposal sites. I mean, the one in East Kilbride, I don't really think copes with what it has to cope with. And in a lot of ways, the queues sometimes generate fly tipping because people just not prepared to sit in the queue. So I think we need a comprehensive review which takes all these things together, not in isolation. Curbside collection is not a means of generating income. It's a necessary part of getting rid of waste. And I think we need a comprehensive review rather than just piecemeal, charging at curbside, charging at tips, etc.
Thanks, Jim. I'll take these comments on board. I have no objection to having a good look at this and see where we're going. So if the officers will note these comments and we'll see where we go with it. Are you Logan? Councillor Logan?
Thank you very much, Chair. I really just wanted to come back on some of the issues that had been raised there. Everything is not just South Lanarkshire Council's fault, housing or whatever. In fact, it's not really anybody's fault. It's how people now live their lives in modern lifestyles. Now, I believe that rapid rehousing, nobody should be homeless. I understand that. And we should try and deal with people as quickly and as best we can. But in actual fact, rapid rehousing, in my view, was really set up because of cities and the bother that cities had getting people housed and various different things. But it's filled out into Scotland wide, and then we deal with the aftermath. So basically, a lot of the problems, youths in the park is not a council problem. We're not a policing authority, but we should be helping with each other. So I think that if there is difficulties, then we should be engaging maybe more with Scottish Government to find out wrap-round solutions for people. There is more mental health problems. There is an extremely large amount of younger, single, vulnerable people coming through the door. They have to be housed. And what right have we to decide, well, some streets should be okay and we will decide who's good people or bad people or any other kind of people? We have to look at people as they come to us and how we deal with them. And we have to deal with them as sympathetically as we can. Equally, we have to deal with the neighbours, because we all get that when you get a person coming in and causing absolute disruption everywhere. But unless there's other services there to help people to try and calm down or to try and lead as much a life as they can, then it's not really going to happen. So basically, it's not just for the council to sort these things. I think that given what's happened over the past 16, 18 months with COVID has increased it greatly. There's been burst-ups in families. I actually know one person where there were 3 people out of one family come in as being homeless because they just all couldn't cope. Now, that wouldn't have happened before. So we've got less houses, more people, more difficulties with people with their mental health and various different issues, a different age group to deal with, and I don't really know the figures as such, but I'm assuming that there'll be a huge increase in single younger people who lead different lives. But we can't just start saying, well, we're going to keep good bits, bad bits and indifferent bits. That's no fair on anybody who lives in these places. And I think it's now time that we seriously start to engage with the agencies and the Scottish Government to give us the support and help that we need to conduct our business. We're a housing authority. Our business is with the house people. But for mental health issues, for different stuff, if they've been in jail and come out and have to be rehoused as soon as we possibly can, then there is other agencies that we have to deal with. And sometimes, it's just my view, they sort of shy back a wee bit and just say, oh, they've got a house, we're all right. So in my view, and I'll be saying this when we have our discussions, I think there is more and more discussion required with all the other outside agencies regarding, youth sitting in parks or doing this or doing that, because we certainly cannot do it all on our own. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eileen. Take on board your comments. We are actually actively discussing with other organisations, police, fire, etc., how we can possibly get through some of the difficulties you're talking about. I'll bring in Danny. Danny's got his hand up. Danny.
Oh, you've probably covered my point there, Chair. Actually, we go back through it, but I would reiterate that point that we have got good partnership working arrangements in with the community safety partners there to tackle the very issues that Councillor Logan has picked up. If youths are congregating in the park or wherever else as well. And what happens is that information then flows through our weekly hub meetings that we have with our partners, and then we share that information and then look at it and see what the trends and the hotspots are, and then come up with what we think is the most effective solution to deal with that. So we have, I would say that we have got really good engagement with partners in the area, and it's something that said, we will still continue to look to build on that. And again, I would also go back in to talk about rapid rehousing and homelessness to say that the group who take forward, and we're working with colleagues in the Health and Social Care Partnership and the like too, and we are feeding back into the Scottish Government. So we are aware, and the team are aware of the various range of supports that are available as well. There's a good report coming to the Housing and Technical Resources Committee next week, which then goes through the kind of outcomes that we've achieved over the course of the last year as well. And you'll see some of the successes that have been highlighted through that programme of work too. And a lot of that comes about through good, robust partnership arrangements too. So, but that said, we do realise there are still issues and concerns that get raised every day and every week, and we will continue to look at the information and the data that's going through and see how we can continue to work with other partners or what else we need to do to continue to improve services for our service users. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Danny. I don't see any other hands raised, so I'm going to move that this item be noted.
I'll second, Chair.
Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Right. Thanks, everyone. There being no other urgent business, I'm going to draw the meeting to a close. Can I ask that the full council meeting be put back to 12:15 to allow everybody the chance for a decent comfort break? Can that be communicated to those members attending full council? Okay. Thanks.